Yeah, good morning to everyone again. And I have started the recording and I'm starting the screen sharing. Okay, can you see the slide now?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Great. So this is where we finished last week. If I'm not mistaken, one of the most important discoveries of the late 18th, early 19th century was the relatedness of Sanskrit, sorry, the language of ancient India, to the majority of the languages spoken in Europe. Okay, Latin and Greek to take the classical ancient languages and their descendants, as well as the Germanic languages and the Slavonic languages. And this was the outline of the story that I gave towards the end of the last occasion. And there was this famous passage from Sir William Jones, which explicitly advocates this idea, although the context, as I said last week, is at least as important as what is said here. And this is where we pick up the story. The really interesting turn in the story is that Indo-European linguistics and Indian studies, Indology, did not really become a serious academic endeavor in England for some reason, and there's been a lot of speculation about this, why this was the case. It actually became an academic discipline in Germany rather than England, in spite of the fact that the information actually came from the English, for the obvious reason that they were there in India, whereas others weren't. And in spite of the fact that the available Sanskrit material in Europe was deposited in France, it was in Paris. In spite of these, Indo-European studies did not become an academic endeavor, either in England or in France. It became a serious academic discipline in Germany. And Germany was really the powerhouse of linguistics and many other things throughout the 19th century. And here, the first name that we need to mention is Friedrich von Schlegel, who published a very important book in 1808. You can see the title here. The title means On the Language and Wisdom of the Indians, published in 1808. Now, Schlegel was he was a young scholar. He was in his 20s when he was actually already renowned as a Greek scholar. Yet he decided at one point that he wanted to study Sanskrit, and he went to Paris, where he met Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is a name that I mentioned last week. He had been an army officer in India, and he learned Sanskrit very well, and he was interested in all matters Sanskrit and Indian culture. And then he went back to England. He was actually Scottish. And then he went to Paris because he knew that that was the only place in Europe where you could actually read Sanskrit manuscripts. So he went to Paris in the early 1800s. But then the Napoleonic War broke out. And because of that, and because of the blockade, he wasn't able to go back to England. So he was stuck in Paris. So what he did was that he, among others, taught Schlegel Sanskrit. He gave Sanskrit classes to Schlegel, and this is how Schlegel came into contact with the Sanskrit language. But he got so excited and so interested that he wrote this book. It's a short book, actually, published in 1808, as I said, which became immensely influential all over Europe. Lots of people read this book, And it actually led to a vogue of Orientalism, a fashion of Orientalism, which was to last well into the early 20th century, at least in some parts of Europe, including Hungary. Actually, quite a lot of the architecture of the late 19th century, early 20th century in Budapest shows this impact of this Oriental fashion. Now, the book is not a book on language. It is not a book on linguistics at all. It is actually a general discussion, a sort of overarching, all-encompassing discussion of Indian culture, literature, religion, everything that broadly speaking belongs in the orbit of the culture of a people. And it includes language. This all-encompassing notion in Germany at the time was the Volksgeist, the spirit, this abstract general spirit of a community, of a people, of a nation. This was called the Volksgeist. Volk is nation or people, and Geist is spirit or soul. Okay. Now, in terms of language, one of the most important contributions to early 19th century linguistics by Schlegel was a distinction that he made between what he called organic versus mechanical languages. Organic languages, as he called them, were basically what we now call inflecting languages or fusional languages. Languages that have a fusional morphology, or in whose morphology fusional phenomena predominate, let's put it that way. Mechanical languages, by contrast, are languages that are either isolating, languages with no morphology or very, very little morphology, and agglutinating languages. Languages in which words can consist of several morphemes, but they are sort of appended. Sorry, they are sort of appended in an automatic fashion, so to speak. And they create lengthy chains of morphemes within a word. Languages like Turkish or Hungarian or Finnish, and many others in the world. And this distinction for him was very important. Organic languages, that is, fusional languages, were somehow seen as better, as closer to some ideal of language, or the relation between language and thought, or language and reality. Now, in terms of what we call Indo-European languages, the relation as he saw it was that he derived all the then known related languages, that is Latin, Greek, and Germanic languages, from Sanskrit. So he saw Sanskrit as the sort of proto-language of the family, even though he didn't use that term, and he wasn't very explicit about these, but the way he discusses language implies that he actually derives all these languages from Sanskrit. He does this on the basis of grammatical structure and also forms. His brother, August Wilhelm von Schlegel, was also a famous linguist, actually. And he was actually more of a he was a more methodical linguist and analyst. He actually distinguished between the three. He was the first to distinguish between the three major morphological types that we now, know and teach as, one of the fundamentals of morphology. The distinction between inflecting languages, isolating languages, and agglutinating languages. This typology goes back to August Wilhelm von Schlegel. It is often thought that it goes back to Humboldt, whom I will talk about a little later. It doesn't actually, it goes back to August Wilhelm von Schlegel. Schlegel's contemporary, a slightly younger scholar of the period and one of the most important linguists of the early 19th century was Franz Bohn, again a German scholar. He, sorry, just a second. He published several important works. Two of the most important comprehensive works that he published were comparative grammars. A shorter one in 1816 was a treatise on verbal morphology, nothing else. The longer work, which took actually more than 10 years to, or almost 20 years to publish in several volumes, is a lengthy comparative morphology of the then known Indo-European languages. The first of the kind, the first comprehensive comparative morphology of any set of related languages in the history of linguistics. He was able to isolate language from other aspects of culture as opposed to Schlegel's romantic holism. He was very methodical, in modern terms, well, one could say more professional, but that's of course a bit misleading to say when you talk about someone who worked 200 years ago. But he studied language in and for itself. Okay, one of the hallmarks of professional linguistics. So he was able to isolate language from other aspects of culture. He was, as I said, highly methodical and analytical. He does morphological segmentation of complex forms, and then he proceeds to a comparison between related languages. And I will just show you an example of how that works in his case in a moment. In the shorter treatise of 1816, he discusses Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Persian, and Germanic. In the larger comparative morphology, he discusses all these languages, and by this time he adds the Slavonic languages as well as Lithuanian, okay, a Baltic language. Well, this is a piece of this frontispiece of the work. The full title is The Conjugation System of the, conjugation system meaning the verbal morphology of the Sanskrit language in comparison with that of Greek, Latin, Persian, and the Germanic language. So the way he works is that he takes a morphologically complex form like this Latin first person singular past form amabam, which means I loved. You know, I love in the present is amo, in the past it's amabam. He analyzes this as consisting of three morphemes. There's a root, which is ama, it means to love. Then there is the tense marker, which is the past tense marker in this case, this ba, and then there is the first person singular marker, the m, at the end of the whole form. Now he takes the last bit, the first person singular marker, and he derives it from the Sanskrit pronoun mam, which is me, the first person singular pronoun. It's actually etymologically the same as English me and all these M pronouns in the Indo-European languages. You have these in German and English and the Slavonic languages and everywhere. You have the M pronouns for the first person singular. He takes the tense marker, the past tense marker ba, and he derives this from the Sanskrit root of the verb to be, which in Sanskrit is bu. It's again actually etymologically related to the English form be. or the German form bin, like in ich bin, I am, or the Slavonic forms also including this be root, like to be in Czech is být, in Russian it's byť. These are all the same forms etymologically. Okay, and it's a very interesting idea that the past tense marker in Latin, and actually also the future tense marker, which includes a be again, should be related etymologically to the verb to be. So the implication is that this past tense form derives from something like, you know, I was loving, or something along these lines. Okay, you see what I mean? Now we actually believe that he was right. We still believe that the past tense marker as well as the future tense marker originally goes back to the verb to be. And these verb forms used to be complex forms, like, as I said, as if in English you said I was loving, or I was in love, whatever. But the fact is that in Bob's case, there was also a philosophical consideration behind this idea. The philosophical consideration was that the verb to be is actually the only real verb. If you remember, we came across this idea when we discussed general grammar or philosophical grammar of the early modern period in the 17th century, 18th centuries, in the Port-Royal grammar. There was this idea which was made very explicit, that the only real verb is the verb to be. Everything else looks like a verb, but in fact they're all be plus something else. Okay, and this is an idea that ultimately goes back to Aristotle. It has an idea with a very long pedigree. Okay, but in this case, this philosophical idea and sound etymological methodology coincided in Bob's case, and as I said, we still believe that he was right on this. Okay, so much about Bob. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me at any point. Okay, the next major figure, yet another German, is Jakob Krim. He was, by training and by profession, for a long time, he was a professor of law. He was also a high-ranking diplomat. He was sent on very sensitive diplomatic missions in the early 19th century. But in Europe, he is mostly known as a famous collector of folk tales with his brother Wilhelm, the brothers Grimm, as they are known. But for us linguists, he is much more important as the founder of Germanic studies. Germanic studies as a branch of comparative and historical linguistics. In his case, perhaps one can say that it was historical rather than comparative, in the sense that he worked primarily on the basis of written sources. Now, his work is quite stunning, as is indeed the work of Bob and all these great personalities that I will discuss here. He analyzed in detail practically all extant texts in all the Germanic languages, meaning all the old Germanic languages, the middle Germanic languages, modern Germanic languages. And that is not just, you know, in our modern terms of the standard language, you can list the Germanic languages quite easily. You can just go through, you know, the German and English and Swedish and so on and so forth. Historically speaking, it's a much larger variety. Okay, if you take only Old High German, for instance, Old High German is attested in at least 4 different major dialects. Okay, and there are quite significant differences between them, and that's only Old High German. And then you have, you know, Low Saxon, and you have Old English and Middle English, and you have Frisian. You actually have Old Frisian and Modern Frisian, and so on and so forth. You have Gothic, of course, an extinct language. You have all the Franconian dialects, some of which developed historically into Dutch, some of which developed historically into a variety of German dialects in the central German area. Um, and of course, the most stunning thing about it is that if you want to, if you get it into your head that you want to read, let's say, old Frisian texts, nowadays, of course, you can go to the internet and you can find a lot online, and you can find grammars, and you can find dictionaries, and you can find all sorts of help for old Frisian, or any of the Germanic languages for that matter. But even, 30 years ago, you could just go to a library, if it was really good library, and you could just pick these books from the bookshelves, and you would find the Old Frisian grammar, and you would find the Old Frisian dictionary and editions of texts, etc. But not in the early 19th century. These handbooks just didn't exist. Grimm had to work with the actual manuscripts. He had to pore over the manuscripts, sort out what's in them, understand them, and then write his big works on the basis of these. It's quite stunning, an achievement, even purely in terms of the mass of the material that he had to go through, and then his acumen that he applied to it. He produced several works. The two really big ones, one is the Deutsche Grammatik, first published in 1819, and then a second edition coming in 3 years' time. This is not a German grammar, as the title suggests. It's actually a huge comparative grammar of the Germanic languages, all of them. Now, the reason I mention the second edition here specifically, most of the works that I talk about here were published several times, and there are several editions of them. The reason I mention the second edition here specifically is that in this edition there was a new section on phonology, which was added, quite a large one actually. It's only this section on morphology is about 200 pages long. And this new section that was added is based partly on Rasmus Rask's observations, who was a Danish linguist of the period, but he only published in Danish. He never published anything in German or any of the better known languages, so he didn't really become famous at that time. But his observations, as they were articulated by Grimm, came to be known as one of the most famous sound changes in the history of linguistics, and this is Grimm's law. Grimm's law is a series of sound changes that shifted the Proto-Indo. Well, in a contemporary formulation, we would put it this way: this is part of Grimm's law, not all of it. The Proto-Indo-European voiceless stops turned into voiceless fricatives in Germanic, so p into f, t into th, k into h. So, for example, you have the word for father in Latin is pater. Latin, didn't undergo Grimm's law. Germanic did. So in Latin you have p, when in English you have f. In Latin you have t, when in English you have th, the th sound. In Latin you have k. In Germanic languages you have h here. Also, the Indo-European voiced stops, but were devoiced into p, in Germanic. So you have, in Czech you have jablko, you have the b here in the middle of the word. In English you have apple with a p. You have duo in Latin, but you have two in English. You have ager in Latin with a g in the middle, and you have aka in English with k in the middle. So that's just a partial reminder of what Grimm's law is. Very interestingly, Grimm integrated his discussion of what came to be known as Grimm's law into a broader framework, which also included what is called the Old High German consonant shift, which is another highly systematic series of changes in the consonant system, in the obstruent system of Germanic. In this case, it's the Proto-Germanic voiceless stops turning into either affricates or fricatives in the southern German dialects, which are called High German dialects, and also the th sound th turning into d in the Old High German dialect. So if you compare English and modern Standard German, which is a High German variety, largely a High German variety, you have English pepper, but you have Pfeffer in German. You have 10 in English, but you have 10 in German. You have break in English, but you have brechen in German. So notice the h sound here as opposed to the k in English. Also, you have 3 in English, but you have drei with a d in an initial d in German. So this is the Old High German consonant shift. Okay, so Grimm's law and the Old High German consonant shift, two of the most important discoveries of comparative phonology in the early 19th century. Then there is the other vast achievement by Grimm, and also in this case the brothers Grimm, and this was the initiation of the huge historical dictionary of the German language, okay, the Deutsches Wörterbuch. It took more than 100 years to complete, and of course they didn't live to see the end of the work, the completion of the work. Ultimately it came to 31 plus 1 volumes, the plus 1 volume being the supplement, which is a huge historical dictionary based on vast historical and comparative material, which became a model for other dictionaries. Several of the major European languages now have a similar huge historical dictionary, multi-volume sets, but very much like the Oxford English Dictionary. Okay, here is just a little bit of how this dictionary works and what it looks like. This is the word nieder in German, meaning low. You can see all the various forms in the various Germanic languages, forms given from Old High German, Middle High German, Old English, Old Frisian, and so on and so forth, all the oldest attested forms of the same word, or the etymologically related words. Okay, then the meaning is given here, and then all the various uses of the word given with illustrations from literary sources. Like here, old poetry, old texts that include this word. Note that this, what I've shown you, is about 7% of the head word, nieder. Okay, this is what a large historical dictionary looks like, which is something you obviously know because you have seen dictionaries like this, but this type of work all began with Grimm and his generation. Okay, this is the brothers Grimm. The one on the left is Jakob. Okay, any questions at this point before I move on? Any questions? No questions? Okay, so the next important figure, still in the early 19th century, is Wilhelm von Humboldt. A polymath, a real polymath, also a politician, an accomplished diplomat, just like Jakob Grimm. He was also an accomplished diplomat sent on sensitive missions more than one occasion. Also, he served as what would now be called a minister for education. He was responsible for reform in secondary education. He was an extremely clever man. He realized that for high quality education, you need high quality teachers. And for high quality teachers, you need high quality teacher training. And for that, you need high quality universities. And he also realized, like I said, he was a very clever man. It's much easier to start from scratch than trying to reform existing institutions. So he established a university from scratch, a university in Berlin, which now bears his name. What is called the Humboldt University in Berlin is the university that he founded in 1810, and he prescribed a new way of functioning for this university. It was something that was almost unknown in university circles, not totally unknown, because there was one example before his eyes. There was the University of Göttingen, which was a small university, and he sort of, to a certain extent, he took that as a model. But it was his idea that teaching and research should be combined in how universities work, in basically how professors work, because that's what a university meant at the time. And this led to a very successful model of universities and higher education that was first emulated all over Germany, and then by the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, it was emulated all over the world. Basically, all the universities, well, I mean, in Europe and in Northern America, in the European cultural sphere, practically all universities were remodeled in the Humboldtian fashion. And it was very much his achievement that in the 19th century, Germany was, throughout the century and well into the 20th century, Germany was really the powerhouse of all sorts of academic disciplines, not only linguistics, but practically everything else. This was because of the highly successful higher education, highly successful universities, and the professorial ethos that he made the norm. Now, he personally was characterized by a vast knowledge of humanities as well as sciences, and also languages. He knew many languages very well. Not only was his knowledge really broad, it was very deep at the same time. He shows an unparalleled understanding of all these. I just mentioned in passing that he also had a famous brother, just like Schlegel. Alexander, his brother, was a famous explorer, geographer, ethnographer, a polymath, just like Wilhelm von Humboldt. Now, in terms of language, Humboldt's achievements include the description and the study of the history of many languages, including languages that no one in Europe really ever studied, like American Indian languages. Or there's a very famous book that he wrote on the Kawi language, which is a Javan language. And as far as I know, I am not an expert on Javan languages, but as far as I know, to this day, his book on Kawi is a standard reference and a starting point for anyone who wants to study this language in an academic sense. Now, one of the fields that he contributed to very significantly was language typology. Well, and general linguistics in the broadest sense of the word. So, for example, he is almost the first, or maybe the first, in the history of linguistics who understood and very clearly articulated the notion that similarities between languages can be attributed to a variety of sources. So he made a very clear distinction between historical similarities that go back to a shared heritage, okay, common ancestry, relatedness in the narrow sense of the word. Structural similarities, which are general in the sense that these are features like, agglutination, for instance. Agglutinating languages represent a kind of a structure. They are not necessarily related, sorry. This is a structural kind of similarity between languages. And languages may also exhibit contact-induced similarities, similarities between languages that are due to contact, extensive contact, which may, leave an impact on the grammar of the language, like between German and Hungarian, for instance. Okay, contact-induced similarities, and there are many examples of these all over the world. Humboldt also discusses at length, and not always very clearly, the relation between language and the perception of the world, how you see the world in the broadest terms and how that is influenced by your native language. And there is this idea of the Weltansicht, the notion that I briefly mentioned last week, if I'm not mistaken, your general view of the world and perception of the world. He was one of those who advocated the idea that the way you see and understand and categorize the world and your experience is dependent on your native language. He also made a point of emphasizing that language is independent from logic, and the way we perceive the world is independent of logic. He also advocated the idea of language as a fully self-contained and coherent whole. This organic view of the language was very typical of him and typical of the period. An organism in which every detail can only be understood with reference to the whole, to the self-contained whole, and not with reference to something that's outside language. Creativity is, again, another feature that he emphasizes very much in the context of language. There are these famous passages that are often cited from him in which he explains that language is energy. It is not a product. It is the creative organ of thought, in a way. Okay. Schleicher, we now come to the last figure of what I call the first half of the 19th century. We are actually in the middle of the 19th century here. And I term him here on the slide the last hero of old school Indo-European linguistics. And I don't mean this to be condescending in any way. He was a brilliant mind. He was a great linguist. He died very young, unfortunately. Well, he was in his 40s when he died. He wrote many important works. The most comprehensive one is a book that he published in 1861 called Compendium, where we use this short title. The full title is A Compendium of the Comparative Grammar of the Indo-European Languages. Yes, which was an extremely important work for several reasons. Now, Schleicher was the first ever to give explicit reconstructions. Even though Indo-European linguistics had existed by this time for, well, practically half a century, but nobody ever had the courage to propose explicit reconstructions, the ones that we mark with the asterisk, you know, that was also his invention. I just said nobody before him had the courage to propose explicit reconstructions. Well, of course, it wasn't always a matter of courage. In many cases, it would simply be assumed that the form from which we derive everything else is the Sanskrit form. Okay, and that's why they didn't feel the need to propose reconstructions in the narrow sense of the word. He was also the first ever to give an explicit family tree of languages in the modern sense of the word, not in the sense in which they used it in the 17th century. You remember with Noah's Ark, okay, stranded on the top of the Mount Ararat, and then Noah's 3 sons, and all the peoples and all the languages branching from Noah's 3 sons. No, I don't mean that. I mean a family tree of languages in the modern sense of the word, which in his case looked like this. This is the original, the German edition. This is a modernized, well, this is an English version of the same family tree. So we have what he calls the original Indo-European language. This is the Ursprache in German, what we would now call the proto-language, Proto-Indo-European. And then this branches off into 2 branches, Slavic, Germanic, and Aryo-Greek, Italo-Celtic. For some reason, it's always a binary branching for Schleicher. We don't know why, but he always does binary branchings. So Slavic Germanic branches off into Germanic and Balto-Slavic, and then Balto-Slavic branches off into Lithuanian, which is one of the Baltic languages, and Slavic. And then the Aryo-Greek Italo-Celtic branches off into Greek Italo-Celtic and Aryan. Aryan branches off into Iranian and Indic, and the Greek Italo-Celtic branches off into Italo-Celtic, and the Greek branch from which we also get Albanian, and Italo-Celtic gives us Celtic, and Italic, which includes Latin as well as a number of other ancient languages. Okay, so this looks like something quite, you know, ordinary in the sense that every single introductory textbook on linguistics has a family tree. It's often of the Indo-European languages, or it may be of some other family. So what's the big deal here? Well, the big deal is that if you draw a family tree for a family of languages, you need to be explicit about what you put where in the family. You need to make it clear, for example, in this family tree, that, let's say, Germanic is closer to Lithuanian and Slavic than it is to Celtic or Italic or Greek or Iranian and Indic. Okay, well, this is what a family tree shows, because the branching of Germanic and the Balto-Slavic languages is later than the branching of Germanic from all the others. Okay, Celtic and Italic languages are more closely related than either is to any of the others within the family. Okay, this is something that you need to make clear. You have to take sides, and you can't, you know, dodge the question of, for example, where you put Sanskrit in the family tree. That's perhaps the single most important issue here. Where do you put Sanskrit in the family tree? And very importantly, Schleicher doesn't put it here. He doesn't say that Sanskrit is the root of the family, and all the other languages derive from Sanskrit. Like many before him sort of suggested this or implied this, or even explicitly said that, you know, Latin and Greek and all the others come from Sanskrit. No, he put Sanskrit here. Indic, okay, Old Indic is Sanskrit. Sanskrit is just one of the many branches of Indo-European. And you can actually claim explicitly that Sanskrit is more closely related to Iranian than it is to Greek, for instance, but it is still more closely related to Greek than it is to Germanic, and so on and so forth. Okay, this is an extremely important claim to make. Okay, and one that has proved very important for the future history of linguistics. Okay, so first ever explicit reconstructions, first ever explicit modern family tree. Schleicher's focus was very much on morphology. Grammar for him practically meant morphology. He doesn't really discuss syntax. He discusses phonology, yes, he does, but in a way that he subordinates phonology very much to morphology. He also shows a very strongly organic view of language, and this organic view was very typical of the first half of the 19th century. It was the sort of pervasive tenor of the discussions of language. And in his case, this is actually very explicit in that he describes the history of languages as a lifespan, like the life of an animal or a human being, a living entity, an organic entity. So you have a birth of some kind, then you have growth, you have a period when the language, just like an organism, grows, becomes more, becomes stronger, more vigorous. Then it reaches a sort of a plateau, and then it begins to decline and fall into decrepitude, like when a man grows old. And then in the end, the language, dies, just like any living entity dies. But he's even more explicit than that. He explicitly distinguishes between the prehistoric period of growth and the historical period of decay. And he divides the prehistoric period into three sub-periods. He claims that in the very beginning, languages consist purely of roots. There are only roots, and there is actually no grammar, strictly speaking, meaning there is no morphology. Then in the next period, an agglutinating structure emerges, which means that the roots are combined with each other in a mechanistic fashion, in an automatic fashion. And then the language reaches the zenith of its development, the highest, the most fully developed form of a language is the inflecting stage. Yes, this is the third stage in the development of a language, and he claims that only two families of languages have achieved this stage: the Indo-European family and the Semitic family of languages. It is only these two families that have reached this zenith of the development. And then languages enter the historical period, which is a period of decay. It is like old age for a human or an animal. The historical period is characterized by two main mechanisms of decay, which are the mechanisms of change. These are sound changes, which only affect the sounds of the language, and what he called analogical changes. Analogical changes practically meaning all sorts of morphological change, as they would generally be called analogical changes in the period. Excuse me. Okay, a very important claim that he makes in this context is that the prehistory or early history and the later history of languages are very different. They are qualitatively different stages in the history of any language. Okay, so as I said, this shows his very strongly organic view of language, which on the one hand manifests itself in general terms in his idea of the life cycle of languages, or the lifespan of languages, which is for him very much like the lifespan of animals or plants. But he also uses the term or this organic metaphor in particular terms, in that he calls inflecting morphology an organic feature of languages. Okay, for him, organic language means inflecting language in this sense, in this particular sense. So stem changes or root changes, like in classical Greek, we have leip, loip, lip as three variants of the same root in three different grammatical functions. This is the present tense, this is the perfect, this is what is called the aorist, it's a kind of a past tense. Okay, you would call this organic morphology. So, to summarize the early 19th century, this is the period when comparative and historical linguistics emerges, Indo-European studies are established as a serious academic discipline, and then the sub-branches appear, like Germanic linguistics, Slavonic linguistics, Celtic linguistics, etc., etc. The languages studied are mainly Old Indo-European languages and archaic Indo-European languages. General linguistics also makes great leaps forward, and we also see the beginnings of institutionalization, the institutionalization of linguistics, meaning mainly professors being appointed at universities, chairs being established at universities. Chairs really mean professors. In this period, a chair is not an administrative unit like at a modern university, but it basically means a job for a professor. And we see this happening mainly in Germany. Some of the most important universities are listed: Göttingen, Berlin, Jena, Leipzig, and a few others. But we also see old philosophical ideas sort of lingering. For example, the idea that the only real verb is the verb to be, and you need to sort of find the verb be in every verb or phenomenon in language. Arbitrariness is not fully embraced yet, which means that explanations for the sound shape of words are often sought somewhere outside language, onomatopoeic origin, etc. The notion of relatedness is ill-defined before Schleicher. Okay, I've been talking about this at length in the context of why the family tree was significant. The focus on morphology, and not only was the focus on morphology in general, but morphology was very often described in evaluative terms, meaning some morphological patterns were seen as better than others. Okay, inflecting morphology is better than agglutinating morphology, but even agglutinating morphology is better than an isolating structure for language, because that means no morphology. And then if you have no morphology, then you don't have anything really in language. You could actually say that in the early 19th century, Theories of language meant evolutionary theories of morphology. The most explicit one being Schleicher's, which we have just seen. Okay, an evolutionary theory of morphology, pure roots developing into agglutinating structure, developing into inflecting structure. Then there was the organic view, which very strongly defined most of linguistics throughout the early 19th century and in some quarters even later. The organic view meant several different things, and these were often actually quite incompatible with each other. The organic view could mean language seen as an organism, language as a self-contained entity that is complete in itself, in which every detail can only be understood as a function of the whole, okay, and not in itself. Nothing in language is anchored outside language. This is one aspect of what the organic view meant, and actually this sense of language as an organism is the distant ancestor of structuralism, as is very eloquently argued by eminent historians of linguistics. Then another aspect of the organic view related to words. Words themselves could be seen as organic in their structure. As I said, several linguists, Friedrich von Schlegel or August Schleicher and several others, advocated the idea that inflecting morphology shows that words themselves behave like organisms. You have a root, and then you have, some vowel change appearing like a sprout coming from a root. Then in another form, let's say in the past tense of a verb, you have another vowel, yet another vowel change, like another sprout coming from the same root. So in this sense, words would be seen as organisms in themselves. And then a third view, which a third sort of manifestation of the organic view, related language to the language community that speaks it. And this assumed an organic, inherent, very close spiritual relation between the language and its speakers. And this has to be understood in the context of this holistic concept of the Volksgeist, the spirit of the nation. There is a very intimate and very close and inherent relationship between the language and the community that speaks it. And this is obviously to be understood in the context of the 19th century idea of the nation, which became a very powerful idea for all sorts of political movements, and we know that part of the story. And this is this last aspect of the organic view is very closely connected to the last point that I list here, which is an a priori difference between the national language and foreign languages, by which I mean the way these languages were approached. It is often seen that well, professional linguists, if you can use the term professional linguist, in the early 19th century, it's a misleading term, but you will see what I mean by it. They would very often advocate the idea that when you study as a linguist, you study your native language, you can't approach it in the same way in which you approach other languages. Your own language is not just one of the many languages. It is somehow special, and it needs to be approached in a special way. Okay, and this is yet another idea that not everybody subscribed to even in the 19th century, but it was something that needed to be left behind for linguistics as an academic endeavor to move forward and to sort of study language in the professionally detached way that we need in any academic discipline. Okay. Any questions? We have somebody added something in the meeting chat. Yeah, Ulrike studied one term at Humboldt University. It must have been great. I'm sure it was great.
Yes, it was.
Okay, any questions? Any comments?
Just one thing about Schleicher. So you say that Schleicher assumes for every language that there's a period of, well, say development and then a period of decay.
Yes, yes.
And I mean, can we, in how far can we say today that this is valid?
It's definitely not.
Okay.
Definitely not. We do of course see language. Well, I think sociolinguists now call it language attrition. Languages do disappear. Yes. People stop using certain languages and they switch to other languages. We see that happening in many places.
Yes.
Which is not the same as saying that languages grow and then they decay. This is something that I will come back to next week when we talk about the neo-grammarians, how they countered this idea. It's also an extremely interesting chapter in the history of linguistics. But no, we definitely do not believe that languages are like organisms. They are like animals or people.
I think it may be interesting, though, that in folk linguistics, this idea somehow remains.
Oh yes, definitely.
Like morals decay, languages become worse and worse.
Yeah. Of course, yes. Yes, definitely. We definitely have that sort of naive idea. We have lots of naive ideas lingering on from the 19th century in the study of language, maybe also in other fields, but I don't want to comment on those. But in discussions of language, yes, we do have these ideas lingering.
All right, thank you.
Yes, any other questions? Who is coming for consultation at 12:30? I don't see the list just now.
It's going to be me, Laura Fišković.
Okay. So I will see you at 12:30, Laura.
Okay, I will be there.
Yeah. We still have time for questions if there's anything that was unclear. We have covered quite a lot of material. But if it has all been clear, I'm happy. And then this is where we shall continue next week. So thank you for your attention and see you in a week's time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.